Tonight we're ready to conclude our study on the Ten Commandments. This study has went by really rapidly, but I've learned much from my study and preparation and presentation of these lessons, and I hope you've learned a little bit along the way as well. I appreciate Anderson filling in for me last week, and he did a good job, and I won't tell you who this individual was, but I think they probably expressed it well. They said, you could have done, speaking to me, not to him, but speaking to me, they said, you could have done as well, but you couldn't have done better. And I appreciated that honest assessment, and I don't consider that a criticism at all. So I appreciate him doing that, and others that fill in and help us in various ways at various times in our classes. Tonight, you shall not covet. You shall not covet. As long as you think more is better, you'll never be satisfied. I showed you a picture earlier in the quarter about a lawnmower and the preacher taking the Lord's name in vain, the cursing lawnmower. You know, the little boy had to sell it to the preacher, and he said, "Preacher, you have to cuss before you get it started." And the preacher said he didn't do that, you remember. And the little boy said, "You pull it long enough, you will." You know, that sort of thing. So that related to that commandment. Well, this one, I was looking, just found myself daydreaming in Lowe's. You know, that's what guys do sometimes. And went over and thought, well, you know, I need a new lawnmower. And why did I think I needed a new lawnmower? You know, is mine not operational or functional? No. Mine, I paid all of $35 for it. $35 for my push mower. It was at an estate sale for some members in Allen's, and I knew it had been gently used, so it was a Craftsman, a good 6 horsepower, you know, Briggs and Stratton engine in it, and I bought it probably close to 20 years ago. Changed the oil, you know, every year, and the filter, spark plug, so it still runs like a sewing machine, or at least that's what my daddy would say. And I don't know what a sewing machine had to do with, you know, other things. But anyway, but I started looking and I thought, you know, here's an electric job. Wouldn't have to, you know, buy gas. You just plug it up. Of course, you have to pay for the electricity. But what really intrigued me about this push mower, you can't see it very well, but it has a set of lights on it. I thought, now that would be great. Because I could wait till after the, you know, the heat of the day, and I could mow, and because it's electric, it would be very quiet, and so I could mow before the dew fell. You know, that might be something optional, but am I going, I think this model was sold for $700 at Lowe's. Am I going to spring for that? Probably not. I'll just keep mowing during the daytime with my old trusty, you know, Craftsman, Briggs and Stratton. Maybe he won't let me down. But, you know, we are living in a time, we live in a country, we live in an economy, in a culture that's always telling you need something more. You need the new and improved version of whatever else it may be. And, you know, if I want to mow at night, I'm not beyond. The boys can tell you it's been more than once when I had a crazy funeral home schedule. One year we had our riding lawnmower at the time that wasn't cooperating, so I made the boys each hold a flashlight, and I was pushing, they were walking alongside of me, and you know, we were mowing at night up and down. Of course, we lived out in the country, so that didn't arouse no animosity from the neighbors. Kyle might get me if I mow, you know, at 9 o'clock at night on Satsuma the way it is now. But anyway, let's get back to you shall not covet. Do we want more? Oh, of course, we always want more, something new or better. I don't know if anyone is a fan of the Russian novelist Fyodor Dostoevsky. He's written a number of volumes that I've found very helpful. And while he's he's already dead long ago, more than 100 years, much inclined to probably New Testament Christianity, he did point out a lot of things that he saw kind of creeping into what would eventually become communist Russia after the revolution. But in his well-known book, some say his magnum opus, The Brothers Karamazov, he said, the world says you have needs, satisfy them. You have as much right as the rich and the mighty. Don't hesitate to satisfy your needs. Indeed, expand your needs and demand more. This is the worldly doctrine of today. Now, he's writing this. I think The Brothers Karamazov was published in the 1880s. So, you know, it's not been yesterday or last year. This is the worldly doctrine of today. And they believe, that is, people in the world, that this is freedom. It's an interesting concept, especially given the cultural context he was writing in. The result for the rich is isolation and suicide. You just want more? Well, you'll eventually isolate yourself, and it's a self-defeating, quest to always want more and more. But for the poor, it's envy and murder. Again, given the cultural context of where he was writing and what he was observing. That's really, really curious to note. But nevertheless, we're more interested in Scripture and the Bible. Long ago, even before Dostoevsky, said this way, Moses concluding, bookending the 10th of the 10 Commandments, the 10 words, the Decalogue in Exodus 20, tells us there to conclude in verse 17, you shall not covet. Now, of course, the full commandment is as it reads. We couldn't put it all on screen, but you shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, nor his male servant, nor his female servant, nor his ox, nor his donkey, nor anything that is your neighbor's. Now, of course, this is addressed to the men of Israel, but clearly you could just as easily make application of it, you ladies, to the way that it would apply otherwise. But do not covet. Do not have this insatiable desire always for more. And really, this commandment is just, as it were, a fitting bookend, like I said, to what preceded it, all of the 9. But the first, kind of the other end of the bookend, started out by, of course, telling us that there are to be no other gods but the true God. God have no other gods beside or before me in Exodus 20, verse 3. Of course, all of these are repeated in Deuteronomy chapter 5. And so the question really is simple. Who will we choose? Will we choose to follow that first commandment in the ramifications of having no other God but the true God, or will we choose ourselves? And really that's how the 10th commandment, I think, provides a fitting summary. Will we let God be God in our lives, or will we choose to be God, try to make ourselves God? That's really the question. And while we usually don't think about it in that sort of weighty language, we tend to think, well, God is God, and I'm going to let Him be God, but, and then we try to justify some of the things that can very easily take on the role of God in our lives if we're not careful. Covetousness is likely, this is my contention, and I would welcome your feedback, whether agreement or disagreement, but covetousness, which is the noun form of the verb to covet, is likely what lies at the foundation of every temptation. You might say it's almost the bait in every trap that Satan puts before us. And I know it might take a little bit of work to get to that point, but really, starting with the first temptation in the garden. You don't have to turn there, but if you wish, you can. You know the episode well, and in Genesis chapter 3, it's not the case, and this is what makes this so amazing, that Adam and Eve were in need of anything. God had created them, had given them to each other, perfectly formed in His image, and in a place of His own, creation that was without any defect. That's what we believe the Garden of Eden was, because the Bible tells us repeatedly in chapter 1, God says, it is good, it is good, it is good. And as man kind of provides the apex of creation, then in God's own image, God said it is very good. And yet in this environment, with these two people having no need whatsoever, having no needs at all. I mean, I was going to say having no needs but there's not even a but. They don't have any needs. Could they desire anything more? Well, it would maybe initially be that we would respond, well, how could they? Every need was met. And yet, still, the devil baits his hook, if you will, with the lure of covetousness. Has God indeed said, you shall not eat of every tree of the garden? And every word, I think, is purposeful in the way he poses that question, especially the word not and the word every. Not eat of every tree of the garden. Eve responds, we may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden, but God has stipulated, He has put a rule in place, and that is the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden. God said, don't eat it, don't touch of it, lest you die. But you will not surely die. And then the wheels begin to turn, almost as it were in her mind. And then Satan helps her by adding, God knows that in the day you eat of it, your eyes will be opened. You'll have something that you don't have now. You'll have more than what you have now. You will be like God, knowing good and evil. Philosophers have through the centuries tried to, debate all that, this verse, all of this proposal, what it might have entailed or what the devil was trying to, present as it regarded his temptation to Eve. And I won't, delve too deep into that. But nevertheless, I think very simply for the purposes of this lesson, you will have more than what you have now, is in essence what the devil is telling her. You will be like God. You will know good and evil. The woman saw that the tree was good for food, and here's where we typically try to classify and categorize our lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes, and pride of life under those broad headings, as temptation is sometimes attempted to be delineated. It was good for food, the lust of the flesh. It was pleasant to the eyes, the lust of the eyes. It was a desirable tree to make one wise, at least according to the devil. So the pride involved in what might result if she takes of it. All of that in conjunction maybe can be summarized under the umbrella term just of wanting more, covetousness. She took of its fruit and ate. She gave also to her husband, and he ate. Now, while a serpent is not going to entice us or tempt us in the same way today, the devil still is active in our world, that much is certain, and the ways in which he operates are many and varied, but again, maybe back of all of it or underlying it all of it is this idea of covetousness, something more than what you have now. And further, if you want to kind of make another deduction, all other commands may very well be broken after this one is broken first, if you will. You might say, well, how so? Well, think of any sin and think about how that in some way, perhaps coveting led to the initial transgression of that commandment. Now, just if we want to stay in Exodus 20 with the commands that we've been studying this quarter, if we bear false witness against our neighbor, there has to be some motivation to do our neighbor harm or for something else to happen to our neighbor than would otherwise have occurred. So that might again be one that we break by coveting first. Certainly some of them are easier than others. You shall not steal. Well, why would one be tempted to steal? It could be that an individual might be lacking the necessities of life, and if you want to have an ethics debate about is it acceptable in the sight of God to steal if you were actually starving to death, you can take some passages in Proverbs and try to twist them. We do that in what's called Human Thought and Values class at Freed Hardeman. Sometimes the boys can tell you about that, or Audrey or White. But, basically, you shall not steal, that idea of just taking what doesn't belong to you just simply because it's not yours, but someone else has it and you want it. That's what's prohibited. So coveting breaks that commandment. Certainly you shall not commit adultery, likewise, in that same category. And it's not surprising that when he says you shall not covet your neighbor's house, he follows it up by saying don't covet your neighbor's wife or spouse. You should not want another other than the one you have, is basically what he's telling them. And we could go through all of that if time allows us, but it's my contention, again, that covetousness may be at the foundation of every temptation, and then breaking the command not to covet by coveting would be the first way that all of these other commands are also, broken, or as we are violating them in the sight of God, if you will. So it's a big deal. It's not something you might be tempted to just read through the list and say, well, my neighbor's house, well, we keep up with the Joneses, but I'm happy where I live. I'm happy with my spouse. We don't have servants today. I'm not worried about an ox or a donkey, anything like that. And you could dismiss this command. And you might just brush it off and saying it's not relevant to modern living. But hopefully my simple explanation to this point has shown you that it is otherwise the case. There are some indications, and this is where we aren't 100% sure again about all of the details, but there is some indication that maybe the devil's, I'm just calling it his problem, that's putting it mildly, of course. He is a created being, just to put it in a succinct fashion. The devil is a created being, so if he is a created being, that means what? Initially he was also a what? Good being. It's the very essence of being. C.S. Lewis talks about this in Mere Christianity. The very existence of being like God, necessitates that we be good. And so everything that God has created is good, or at least it originally was. And since the devil is not equal to God, he then must be a created being. Thus, he must have originally been a good being. I know this is a lot to kind of take in. I don't want to go too far down the rabbit trail, but he's not good now. That much is evident also. So how did he get from good to bad, to sinful to otherwise? Well, a combination maybe of pride and covetousness. 1 Timothy 3, verse 6, when Paul tells Timothy to look for men to oversee the church, to serve in the role of an elder, he gives them criteria. He gives Timothy criteria or characteristics. We sometimes just say qualifications. I think that's an okay term too. That these men, they should be evident in their lives. And interestingly, as we've explored in our leadership class, every Christian man, as he matures, should also exhibit these same qualities and grow in them. But Paul, before he transitions into qualifications or characteristics of deacons who serve under the elders, he just kind of tacks this on. He said, this man cannot be a novice or a new Christian, we would say. He's not to be a beginner in the faith. Why is that a problem, Paul? We could think of a lot of reasons practically, but he says, here's the main point: lest being puffed up with pride, he fall into the same condemnation as the devil. What does it mean to be puffed up with pride? An elevated sense of self? Probably, or ability. Could it also be that covetousness is a first cousin to pride, if not a twin brother? Maybe so as well. Later, well, that should pop up. There we go. In Jude 6, as well as in 2 Peter 2, verse 4, the fate of the evil one and those who follow him. Apparently, they were, again, spiritual beings, so the word angel is used here to describe them. They did not keep their proper domain. God had placed them in a position and given them a task or given them a responsibility or a work that they, were not content with. They wanted something else. They maybe even sometimes we say, is coveting always wanting more? I know that's the tendency that we have, but coveting can also be not just maybe wanting more, but maybe wanting something else instead of just wanting more. Sometimes it's both and, sometimes it can be either more or something different. But they left their own abode, notice that language, and God is reserved in everlasting chains under darkness for the judgment of the great day. And so coveting, again, back even before, if we're taking the devil's fall, as it's often called, or Satan's fall and those that went along with him before creation, before the events recorded in Genesis 1, this has been an issue from time immemorial. So certainly it's still something that we deal with this evening. This command prohibits both attitude of mind as a primary, if you will, catalyst that is often, though, of course, understood or observed by outward behavior. But it begins with an attitude of mind. And looking at these 10, at least as I'm kind of reading through them, most of them we tend to focus on the outward behavior that might accompany or might be displayed by breaking them. For instance, you shall have no other gods before me is followed up by us saying have no carved images, or God says no idols of any kind. Maybe the first command is also this attitude of mind, and I meant to put that in there kind of just as a qualification. But the others, for instance, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. That kind of insinuates, doesn't it, that you're actually using those words. Now, it's true that in your mind, you could think that, you could say it in your head without saying it out loud, and all of us maybe have been guilty of, vulgarity in that regard. We may not have uttered it with audible words, but we may have thought it, and that certainly wasn't approved by God either. But again, we tend to think, okay, taking the name of the Lord in vain, I have to say it or someone else has to hear it. Remember the Sabbath day. Again, there's some part of an inward attitude, but it would be demonstrated for these people in what they didn't do, namely work on that day. There were other, of course, requirements, as Moses details. Honor your father and mother. Is that an attitude of mind? Well, yes, but it's also, again, most often demonstrated in how you behave. Do you obey them when they tell you to do something? Major, minor, or in between. You shall not murder. Now, again, we tend to think that involves an outward action, and that involves, very, very serious outward action. But when we come to do not covet, that starts inwardly before it shows itself outwardly. However, to say all of that then and to tie it back together, Jesus understood the connection. And we've referenced Matthew 5 often in this quarter of study. Jesus understood the connection that what I think impacts what I do. And he knew that long before Freud ever made all of his silly conclusions. And I'm not saying, that we shouldn't think about our mind and our attitude and our cognitive processes. That's important. But Jesus said outward action originates from what you think about. So instead of saying do not murder, he said that's what the law commanded. He quotes straight from Exodus 20 verse 13. But I say unto you, don't be angry with another person, because anger is going to lead you down a path that may very well lead to your taking another person's life. Again, we're civilized folks, and we say, well, I can be mad at somebody and not kill them. Well, maybe you can, and no doubt all of us have. But Jesus is warning us. He goes on in the same chapter, adultery. Yes, it involves a physical act, but are there some precursors that might get you into that compromising, illicit relationship or situation? Of course there are. And as we continue to go through the list, you can see all of these again replicated, but the warning is don't covet. Don't want something more. Don't want something different. Don't want, always just otherwise than what God has given. So the previous 9 cannot merely be kept only by abstaining from external action. That's why I think it's a bookend. If you just take the 10 Commandments as your checklist, which apparently some did in the ancient world, and even some people do today. You've seen the billboards that say, keep the 10 Commandments or something to that effect. What did the state of Louisiana do last week? Anybody follow the news? State of Louisiana says what? Every public school classroom starting in the fall will have what? A copy of the 10 Commandments posted in every classroom. Good thing, bad thing? Most would say it's a good thing. I'm waiting. I've not heard yet that there have been challenges to it, but I'm sure those are already lining up from other religious groups and, of course, groups that are opposed to Christianity especially, but we'll wait and see kind of what goes along with that. But certainly, if we could instill within our children and every member of society, live a life devoid of murder and adultery and stealing and lying and, vulgarity in your speech, we'd be all for that. And yet at the same time, it's not merely just a checklist that some people think can still today put one in a right relationship with God. The idea that I'm a good person, you've heard people say that. I'm just as morally upstanding as those hypocrites that go to church. That's sometimes what people like to tell preachers. I'm just as morally, acceptable or, morally righteous as they are. And they'll maybe cite something like this. I don't kill anybody. I don't cheat on my spouse. I don't, steal from others. My word is my bond, so I'm a good person. That's the conclusion. And yet, I think what we see in the 10th commandment is do not covet is a mindset that should have been, again, something that would have been maybe implicated in just not only their outward behavior, but in their inward thoughts and made a difference as well. Unfortunately, many times it does not. So let's think about these words. Coveting, lusting, envy, all of these things are similar. Of course, covet is the Old Testament word used most frequently. In the New Testament, the word lust and envy are more commonly found. And I put on your worksheet there some of the original term, or the original Hebrew word, hamad, means just simply that. And what's of interest, at least in my study of this, is that these words are morally neutral. They have no inherent or intrinsic value. And that means that desire itself is something that can be directed. The Lord never tells us not to have any desires. He has built within us certain desires. the desire for food, for survival. Otherwise, God has given us desire. So desire is not the problem, but how that desire is directed. That's where the problem comes in. So we might ask this question. Is it possible to covet, quote, in a good way? And if so, how? This is a little bit of a trick question. I'll go ahead and warn you if you're tempted to answer. Okay. Paul says in the New Testament, 1 Corinthians chapter 12, and again at the end of 13 as he transitions, earnestly desire the best gifts. That sounds a lot like coveting. Have you ever heard someone say, I covet your prayers? I've heard people say that. I've probably told somebody that. I covet your prayers. I strongly desire them. So is it possible to covet in a good way? Maybe. We can desire good things, and we should desire good things. To use another example from Paul, make sure I'm quoting him correctly. Remember what he says after he gives the long, beautiful explanation of what was included in the gospel and how God had unfolded it through the centuries. You remember then he turns in Romans chapter 9 to the Jews who were still being obstinate, refusing to accept Jesus as the Savior, as the Old Testament promised Messiah. And so he spends chapters 9, 10, and 11 trying to tell them how they still fit into God's plan. And as our Bibles are divided, chapter 10, verse 1, Brethren, my heart's desire and prayer to God for Israel is that they might be saved. That's what I want. That's what I have a strong desire for, Paul says. That's what, if we wanted to use the word covet in one sense, it might fit there. And he even said in the previous chapter, in chapter 9 and verse 3, I myself, I could wish that I were accursed from Christ for my brethren, my countrymen who are according to the flesh. I wish I could get them to open their eyes. I pray, I beg, I plead. It's my desire, and it's what I'm spending my life attempting to do to help them see, who Jesus is and why they need to turn in obedience to Him. So, it's maybe possible. I think usually the word covet carries with it kind of a negative connotation, as do envy and lust, and especially the word, for instance, envy we might associate with synonyms like greed or jealousy. The word lust, by and large, in our day, is typically reserved only for sexual desire. And that's not how the word was originally used. The word is more broad than that, but again, don't do this, but if you were just to do like an internet search on the word lust, you would be instantly bombarded with things that you don't need to see or look at. And because of that's how the word has kind of taken on that connotation that it refers to sexual desire, but the word is more broad than that. And so when we are wanting something more or different, when it's misdirected, when we're not content with what God gives or provides, then we're guilty of this coveting or lusting or envy. Then the second question that's at the bottom of the first page there in the workbook, is it acceptable to desire what another has just as long as we don't take any action? Is it okay to do that? Or maybe we could follow it up by saying, is it a good idea? And this, again, is a little bit of a tricky sort of, question as well. It gets a little sticky on some points. There's probably only 3 people in the audience, other than me, who when I say Titus, Elijah, Nora, and Levi, it's not the name of a band, it's not, a quartet or anything, but Titus, Elijah, Levi, and Nora are 3 brothers and a sister that my family, that Amy and I love very much. And what we love so much about Titus, Elijah, and then Nora, and then Levi, I got them out of order a moment ago, was what a wonderful job their parents, John and Shanna, did of raising them and teaching them to be, faithful Christians. And they still are, all 4 of them, today. And I remember in our early years of marriage and in our early parenting attempts, asking and looking and desiring, we want to do that. That's what we want to do. We want to raise children that love the Lord and that follow Jesus. So there was a strong desire to have what this family had, as it were. And so you might say, well, okay, yeah, that's acceptable. That's something that's in the realm of good things that you should want. But again, this particular command, not coveting in the context that we find it in Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5, is probably in that sense of wanting something that isn't yours. In fact, if you'll turn to the back of the next page, or the back of the page in your workbook. Yes, go ahead, Doug. Sure.
So I think we can look at stuff and say, hey, that's nice, whatever. And I have an example. You get a brand new Tennessee baseball national championship hat, okay? And I really like that. And I'd like to have that. But I don't think I actually coveted it. You know what I'm saying?
Until you take action to clunk me on the head and take it from me, right? I'll buy you one before you have to do that. So, yeah. And that's kind of hard, where we say, well, how close can I get to the line of wanting it before I take any action, to take it? When I said it's a good idea, well, maybe not, because of maybe where it leads my thoughts to go. Don? Sure.
He talks about having respect for person and things like that that we've been discussing there. Well, I'm not prejudiced against all that, but we all have a little bit of that in us, and if I get to the point where I say, well, I never think about things that I covet, I have to be real careful about everything. Well, I do.
Absolutely. The Bible warns us not to give the devil a foothold, not to let him take advantage of us. And I think coveting is one of those areas where we can, maybe unlock the door that we might be letting the devil have access to. One of the, heartbreaking things, for instance, when he talks about, not coveting your neighbor's wife or something. There are people that say, well, I wish my husband or I wish my wife were different in this way or that way, whatever, that difference might be. And, they never plan on taking any action. But if I let my mind dwell on that, I don't know, I'm not claiming that I understand, how all of this might even work, but, could I be, unlocking the door to give the devil an opportunity to tempt me or to put me in a compromising position, perhaps? So I need to be content, and we'll talk about that kind of as we close if we go through it rapidly. Cole said it this way in his commentary. He said, ultimately, to desire and try to obtain the property of another is to be dissatisfied with what God has given. I like that phrase especially, and thus to show a lack of faith in His love. If I'm dissatisfied with what God has given, I'm showing a lack of faith in His love. Further, the envy which this encourages will lead sooner or later to the hurt of one's neighbor, and this is inconsistent with the primary duty of love. And so it even revolves around that idea. Now, can you think, and we just give them to me really rapidly here, some Old Testament examples of those who coveted and the dangers that it brought into their lives? We've already mentioned Eve. Who? Okay, Ahab. And if you were here last week, you got a taste of Ahab with Naboth's vineyard, Jezebel's action kind of facilitating that. David, certainly. What about Joseph's brothers? What about Mrs. Potiphar? You could go on through the list. Let me read these to you really quickly. In Ecclesiastes 4 and verse 8, the wise man Solomon said, "There is one alone who has without companion, neither son nor brother, yet there is no end to all his labors, nor is his eye satisfied with riches. But he never asks, for whom do I toil and deprive myself of good? This also is vanity and a grave misfortune. His eye is never satisfied." And that kind of recurrent theme runs throughout the book of Ecclesiastes. You remember our lesson on it a few Sunday mornings ago. Proverbs 27 and verse 20, the Bible says, "Hell and destruction are never full." Well, that's kind of an ominous statement. So, here's his point, the parallelism. The eyes of man are never satisfied. And that's an accurate assessment. Never satisfied. And too many are described in that way. New Testament examples of coveting. Who can you put on that list? We talked about one of these guys a couple of Sunday nights ago. 30 pieces of silver, he sold out the Savior. Judas wanted something more than what he had, didn't he? Seems like he would fit into that category. Who else? Simon, the sorcerer in Acts chapter 8. Ananias and Sapphira in Acts chapter 5. The religious leaders who persecuted Jesus and eventually, of course, took his life by that betrayal. Mark 7, 20 to 23, Jesus said that covetousness is something that comes out of the heart of a man, and that's what defiles him. James 1, 13 to 15 talks about that God doesn't tempt anyone. He gives us that which we need. And so it's then in chapter 4 where James says, "Why do you fight and quarrel? What are the source of all of your contentions and problems and all of this? It's because you have made yourself a friend of the world instead of a friend of God. And you're desiring things other than what you should. And you have an unhealthy desire. You have a lack of contentment." And so that's something that we all must push back against. Here's kind of my summary statement. Dating to the end of the Second World War, our nation has enjoyed wealth and prosperity on a scale never seen in history. And I just want you to think about how we often read Scripture. It's natural for us because, after all, the only person that we have to deal with mainly is ourselves. We see things through our own eyes, through our own lens and time and place and so forth. But think about what Jesus said when he said in Luke 12:15, "Take heed and beware of covetousness. One's life does not consist in the abundance of the things he possesses." Okay, that's what Jesus said. The well-known passage in Matthew chapter 6, verse 25, when he talks about you can't serve two masters. You can't serve and love God and money. Mammon is the word that's used there, but money, the goods of this world. So don't worry about what you're going to eat, what you're going to wear, what you're going to get out of this life. Seek first the kingdom of God and His righteousness. Don't be like the soil in Matthew 13:22 that's filled with thorns that are the deceitfulness of riches and the cares of this world. Jesus wrote that at a time when those people, even the richest among them, were impoverished compared to what we have as middle-class Americans today. Where have you fallen on that scale? You may say, well, I'm on the lower end of the middle class. You still had more than anybody in the first century. Much, much more. Much, much more than a lot of people in the world even today. And yet we read these passages and they still warn us. And so it's curious, at least to me, how that can be true. I've already skipped that. Those coveting warnings, I think, are a bit unusual. The Bible warns us, and here's where we have to end, about deifying desire. Ephesians 5:5 and Colossians 3 verse 5 both basically give us the same warning that covetousness is idolatry. Wanting more, wanting something different becomes an idol in my heart, becomes an idol that separates me from God because I have turned my trust and faith and confidence in Him into something else that I want to pursue more. And put in those terms, we take no joy, but I think all of us would have to nod in agreement and say, well, sometimes, yeah, I'm guilty. I've been guilty of this. Yes, I have been an idolater. I've been covetous. by wanting something more different than what God has given and not being content with what He does provide. 1 Timothy 6:6-10, and again in verse 17 to 19, read that not within the context of the abundance that we have, which is true and it should be read with that application, but even read it thinking about what Timothy was warning about the rich of his day, not to put their trust in and not to put their confidence in those things, not to be so caught up with all the things that this life has, but instead just to trust God. And when you read it in that, again, understanding of what life was like in the first century, I wonder if somehow, some way, we're just imagining hypothetically, if Paul and Timothy and Jesus could look at our conditions in the world today, would they say, all of you trust too much in your riches, all of you covet too much, all of you are not content with what you have? And it's something that deserves greater, maybe thought, greater meditation, and change and correction as needed. How do we avoid coveting? Be grateful. I think gratitude is maybe a very important step. Be grateful for what the Lord gives. Trust in His promises that He'll take care of us, and let that be our guide as we go through life. Well, it's been a great study. Our time's gone for tonight. If you have any other questions about the Ten Commandments, I've not given you the final word on them for sure, but I hope at least we've given you some things to maybe think about, that how they can incorporate or be incorporated into your life today. But I'd be happy for your further comments and questions as you might have them. Feel free to give them. Thank you for your good attention and study with me this quarter.